Your brain does not stay clean by accident. Every night, while you sleep, it runs a hidden wash cycle, a state-dependent process that helps move metabolic waste out of brain tissue and reset signaling for the next day. That matters because when this process slows, the brain can carry more of yesterday into today. Focus gets heavier. Memory feels slower. And the fog many people blame on age can actually reflect a system that did not finish its overnight work. The real question is not whether the brain has a cleanup system. It clearly does. The question is, what keeps that system from doing its job before morning? The deeper pattern is that sleep is not one uniform state. The brain seems to depend on the right internal conditions, especially during deep non-REM sleep, when fluid movement and vascular rhythms are better aligned for clearance. Think of it like a drainage system after a storm. The pipes are there, but if the pressure drops, the waste stays behind longer and starts backing up into the rest of the network. That is why the simple explanation falls short. It is not just about sleeping more. It is about whether sleep reaches the physiology the brain needs to actually clear what it accumulates. Recent research has made that picture sharper. Sleep-dependent brain clearance has been linked to aging, poor sleep patterns, and long-term neurodegenerative risk, and newer monitoring work suggests the system may shift across the night with sleep state rather than flip on and off like a switch. So the missing piece may be the mismatch between what sleep looks like on the clock and what sleep looks like in the brain. And once you see that mismatch, the biggest misunderstanding becomes obvious. Not all sleep leaves the brain equally clean. The problem is not just time in bed. It is whether the brain ever reaches the state where cleanup can finish. Fragmented or shallow sleep can weaken that process even when the total hours look normal. That leaves one unresolved question. What in modern life keeps pulling the brain out of that state night after night? The evidence keeps pointing to the same pattern. Sleep is when the brain's cleanup system becomes most active, but only when the body creates the right internal conditions for fluid movement and waste clearance. When those conditions weaken, the next day can feel slower, heavier, and more fogged than it should. That is why the simple explanation falls apart. It is not just about how long you sleep. It is about whether the brain actually reaches the state where clearance can finish before morning. The real question is simpler and harder at the same time. What keeps disrupting that nightly cleanup signal so the brain starts the day already behind? The next layer makes the picture sharper. The brain's waste clearance system is state-dependent, working best during deep non-REM sleep, when slow-wave activity, cerebrospinal fluid movement, and vascular rhythms are more tightly aligned for metabolite removal. That matters because it means the problem is not only not enough sleep. The deeper issue is whether sleep reaches the physiological state that allows the brain to finish its cleanup work. So the missing piece may not be time alone. It may be the specific sleep physiology that turns clearance on in the first place. And that raises a harder question. What quietly shuts that state down before the brain can do its job? Recent studies point to something even more specific. Fragmentation and loss of slow-wave sleep can impair glymphatic clearance and reduce brain metabolite removal, even when total sleep time looks normal. That is the part most people miss. Sleep is not one uniform state. The brain appears to need a particular sleep architecture to complete the clearance job, and when that architecture gets broken up, the process weakens. So now the missing piece is becoming clearer. The real issue may be the loss of the deep physiological rhythm that powers clearance, not just the number of hours on the clock. And that leaves one last question hanging. What is modern life doing to those slow-wave patterns night after night? Here, the story gets sharper. The evidence suggests that sleep fragmentation and disrupted deep sleep can impair glymphatic function and weaken cognitive performance, while environmental factors like light, noise, and temperature can also interfere with the sleep conditions the brain depends on. So the missing piece is not some vague idea of rest. It is the preservation of the exact sleep conditions that let slow waves, vascular rhythms, and fluid movement work together. When modern life breaks those patterns apart, The brain may still be asleep, but not fully clearing what it should. That is the contradiction most explanations ignore. You can spend enough hours in bed and still fail to create the physiology the brain needs. And once that happens, the cleanup system starts the next day already compromised. The broader evidence now suggests this is not a niche theory. Sleep-dependent brain clearance has been linked to aging, poor sleep patterns, and long-term neurodegenerative risk, which is why researchers keep returning to the glymphatic system as a key piece of the puzzle. Newer human monitoring work even suggests the system may not be a simple on-off switch, but something that changes across the night in relation to sleep state and disruption. That changes the frame entirely. The question is not whether the brain has a cleanup system, it clearly does. The question is how often modern sleep patterns keep that system from doing the job it was built to do. So the missing piece may be the mismatch between what sleep looks like on the clock and what sleep looks like in the brain. And once you see that mismatch, the biggest misunderstanding becomes obvious. Not all sleep leaves the brain equally clean. The final piece is that the brain's cleanup system is not only about sleep duration, but about the physiological state inside sleep itself. Deep, stable sleep gives the brain a better window for metabolite clearance, while fragmentation and shallow sleep reduce that window and leave more waste behind. That means the common "just sleep more" advice misses the real biology. If the sleeping brain keeps getting interrupted, the clearance process may never fully settle into the pattern it needs. So the issue is not just whether you were unconscious for 8 hours, it is whether your brain ever reached the state where cleanup could actually happen. And that leaves one unresolved question. What exactly in modern life keeps pulling the system out of that state? The real misunderstanding is thinking this is about sleeping enough in a simple way. The brain's cleanup system depends on stable sleep physiology, and when sleep gets fragmented, the clearance process can weaken even if the clock says you were in bed long enough. That matters in daily life because it explains why one person wakes up clear while another wakes up carrying fog, pressure, and slower recall. The difference is not always dramatic on the outside. It can be a quiet failure in the brain's overnight housekeeping. So the sharper lens is this: look less at total hours and more at whether sleep ever reached the state where the brain could finish its cleanup work. That is the biological question modern routines keep hiding. And once you see it, everything about morning clarity starts to look different. What most people call normal aging is often a blurred view of a more specific process. The brain can lose cleaning efficiency when sleep becomes shallow, broken, or physiologically incomplete, and that changes how clearly you think the next day. In other words, the brain is not just being rested or not rested, it is trying to complete a nightly clearance cycle, and modern sleep disruption can make that cycle partial instead of finished. That is the biggest takeaway. The cleaner the sleep state, the cleaner the brain may be by morning. And the question left standing is simple but important. What if the problem is not that your brain is failing, but that your nights are no longer giving it the conditions it needs? The brain's cleanup problem is not a mystery once you see the pattern. It is tied to sleep physiology, not just sleep time. And that means shallow, fragmented nights can leave the brain carrying more waste into the next day. That is why the same number of hours can produce very different mornings. One night allows clearance to finish. Another leaves the system only partly done, and the difference shows up as fog, slower recall, and a heavier mental feel. Practical sleep notes. Small changes in the sleep environment can matter more than people think. A cooler, darker, quieter room, less bright light before bed, and a more consistent sleep schedule may help the brain reach deeper sleep more reliably. Avoiding heavy meals, caffeine late in the day, and screen light close to bedtime can also make the night less fragmented. So the real question is no longer whether sleep matters. It does. The real question is whether modern life is quietly stripping away the conditions that let the brain clean itself properly. And that is the lens you should keep now when you think about your own nights and mornings. The biggest misunderstanding is treating this like a simple on-off switch. Asleep means cleaned. Awake means dirty. The biology is more precise than that. Sleep has to reach the right internal state for the brain's clearance system to work at its best. And when that state is interrupted, the process can stall or weaken. That is why this story matters beyond theory. It gives a sharper way to read your own symptoms, habits, and mornings without reducing everything to age or bad luck. This content is for educational purposes only and is not medical advice. Your brain has been signaling this for longer than you think. Now you know how to see it. If this changed how you think about your body, subscribe and explore the rest of the series in the description below.